For me, the holy grail, the vision is the 10 trillion that gets settled into philanthropic vehicles over the next 15 years is all in on impact and still makes enough income to still do all the granting that it would have done. For me, that's just like win-win.
Welcome back, everybody. My name is Rich Baker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Tom Hall, who's the Global Head of Social Impact and Philanthropy at UBS. He has over 16 years of work in this area, leading the global philanthropy services to basically help their clients identify and achieve philanthropic and impact investing strategies. A few weeks ago, he wrote a LinkedIn article talking about some of the work and where he sees the movement needing to go. Basically, they were on the idea that a new platform for collective philanthropy is needed to catalyze investment into social entrepreneurs. So today we'll be speaking in more detail about what he sees as the potential for collective philanthropy, and more broadly, speak about his 20 years in philanthropy, UBS's long history with philanthropy, but also blended finance and impact economy, like how all those things are going to come together. So thank you very much, Tom, for taking the time to join us. It's really great to have you with us to talk about the work you're doing, where you're seeing philanthropy going, diving into the nuts and bolts of that process.
Yeah, well, thanks, Richard, and thanks for having me on the podcast. So I'm Tom Hall. I am an impact chaser at heart, and have the privilege of leading UBS's social impact and philanthropy team. It's about 150 people globally, which, as you said, is here to support our clients to try and maximize the impact that they can gain from their wealth. And what's super exciting about my job is we see so much demand for impact. Like every time we survey our clients, whether it's in Asia or around the world, we know that 90% are engaged in some form of philanthropy. So, we are literally just trying to speak into that demand and really help our clients use precious resource of philanthropic capital, but also their investment capital and their operating businesses to drive real world impact.
The work itself, what is it that you do? I mean, you have a billionaire walk in and say, I want to save the world with my money. How do you pick that up at UBS Social Impact and help them go forward from there?
So look, at a practical level, impact is personal. So our value proposition is we want to help you maximize your impact. And we do that through three things. Insights. So we do conferences, we convene and matchmake philanthropists with one another. We have something called the Global Philanthropist Community, which is about 800 people now. Then that really feeds into an advisory process. So really helping that individual client think about, okay, what is it I want to achieve, right? And what's the best way for me to do that? We spend time with families, and I use that word deliberately because often impact is about legacy. It's about, particularly for families of significant wealth, it's multi-generational. So how are you going to plan that out? How are you going to involve your family in that over generation? And a lot of these first gen wealth creators, they're like, well, I'm not sure I'm going to give all the money to the kids because, is that really great for them? And, but how much is too much? And, how should I set it up? Getting into that bit is actually often the precursor before you can actually start executing on real world impact. And then the third dimension of what we do is that execution piece. So we don't just talk about it. We don't just have nice events. We don't just advise people on what they should do and tell them to go off and do it. What we found is actually people really need help to structure it. And then because that's part of our advice, we've found that actually over the last 20 years through something called the UBS Optimus Foundation, we've actually built a shelf of what I call high impact philanthropic investment opportunities. So where can I move the needle in health, education, the environment, in different geographies? And we probably have about 200, 300 recommended partners, and increasingly we like to use the term impact unicorns that we think have the potential to have an impact in the billions that we recommend to our clients. And if our clients choose to allocate capital to anything through that Optimus platform, we add a 10% match. So that's really the core of our offer.
Actually, I want to step back a little bit. Can you define philanthropy a little bit and how you see it? Because one, the size and number that you're talking about is vastly different than the average person, I'd argue, has a concept for philanthropy. They're thinking more maybe charity or maybe just donations, where you're talking at a different level. And then the second thing is the fact that it's coming back so it can do more good later. Like, that's not giving money away anymore. That's actually much more like an investment model.
Charitable giving, typically, as you give money to an organization, you don't have that much sense of what the impact is, right? You trust the organization, they tell you some stories, hopefully it's having impact, but the transparency may not be there. We tend then to talk about strategic philanthropy, which is where you're really trying to measure the impact of your philanthropy. Now, what is impact? And I always start with this. It's not how much you spend, right? Like, it's not how many schools you build. Impact is ultimately about measurable outcomes. are kids learning because of the inputs that you put in? Are you saving lives? Are you reducing carbon in the atmosphere because of the trees you planted or the avoided deforestation, right? So really measuring tangible outcomes. And then the question is, what's the cost of that outcome, and how can I get to that outcome as efficiently as possible? So when I start talking about recycling philanthropy, I'm still really talking about, at a technical definition, typically philanthropic capital is in a number of jurisdictions, that'll be money that you've put into a foundation, into a donor advised foundation, and is tax enhanced, right? So it's money you can't get back for yourself. You've already decided that capital is for impact, and the question is do I deploy that, to drive outcomes purely as a one way? I've given a grant and I get those outcomes back. That's the standard model. Or increasingly, there are opportunities where you can go, well, actually, the business model of this particular intervention, for example, I might invest in a low-cost private school, which will give me education outcomes which I can measure. But because their families are paying for that education, the school can repay the loan. The loan might be interest-free, or it might be only, or it might be very competitive compared to what that school might be able to get otherwise. So if you can get this outcome and get your money back, well, why wouldn't you do that? Now often, just to riff on that particular example, you might go, well, yeah, those private schools sounds great, but they're only targeting people who earn $3 to $5 a day, and I want to target people in rural areas earning $1 a day, and they can't afford that. Fine, okay, so then maybe you have to focus on a grant-based model, or you start working on a different way to recover your capital, which is one of the things we've done a lot of work on, which is partnering up with governments to pay for impact, right? So we've actually got a contract in Ghana mentioning that particular country, whereby the Ghanaian government and the UK government, through something called the Education Outcomes Fund, are paying $68 per child per year for a verified outcome, and the outcome is verified by KPMG in a control trial. So it's like the highest standard of impact verification you can get. And what we're doing with the philanthropic capital is investing in millions of kids to try and meet those education outcomes, and then we literally get repaid by government. So again, that philanthropic capital recycles. At a macro level, if we want to look at philanthropic capital in its totality, it's about $2 trillion today, like asset value in foundations and donor advised funds. 400 billion roughly, give or take, given away every year, which is the income off the assets plus additional flow throughs, right? But we estimate, and Forbes backed me up on this about 18 months ago, that because of this huge global wealth creation, that number could go to 10 trillion by the mid 2030s, right? So we're seeing a huge growth in philanthropic capital. Sounds exciting, sounds big, and it is, right? But if you use the Sustainable Development Goals as a proxy, the estimate is we need 30 trillion by 2030 to meet the funding gap for that, right? So actually, it's almost incumbent on us to find more sustainable ways, ultimately more investable ways to solve these issues.
With that in mind, what do you see as the potential for this, industry, this medium, to deliver and drive impact at scale? And what are some of the key challenges that you'd say hold it back from achieving the vision?
So I think philanthropic capital should only play where it's required, right? So again, looking at the SDGs, one area around clean energy, which is also part of pathway to net zero. That's fully investable now, largely. Maybe not in every emerging market, but certainly in developed markets, you can make a sustainable market risk adjusted return by investing in those strategies. So philanthropic capital doesn't really have a role to play there, I would argue, right? But then there may be other areas, like for example, education. Okay, so you've got particularly in emerging markets. And so one example I often use is there's, I think, 600 million people who can't read and do basic maths. And we know if you can get a tertiary education, you can 10x your income. Go from $200 a year to $2,000 a year. I mean, it's life-changing. Yet the only option, if you're not lucky enough to get a scholarship for millions and millions of young people worldwide, particularly women, is pay a 40% APR on a loan, which is basically saddling you with debt for the rest of your life. So they don't take it, so they don't get the education, and we all don't realize the economic benefits. Traditional philanthropic model for that would be to do more scholarships, but the problem with scholarships is they're really capital inefficient. $1 million maybe does, one place at an Ivy League school and 10 local emerging market university, right? If you invest the capital and give away the income, to provide that model to all the kids who might need it, to recognize the economic benefits of doing so, you need $60 trillion in philanthropy. And as we said, there's only 10. So it's just not scalable. But what happens if you lend some of that money directly to these people through, fair price student financing instruments? So we actually trialed an income share agreement with about 10,000 students. And it was a $22 million pool of capital, whereby Philanthropic Capital was taking a first loss position. So instead of giving the money to the students, it was still lending it, but it was lending it, with a higher risk premium. And by taking that additional risk, it meant we could borrow another $10 million at 4%, not 40. So you're taking Philanthropic Capital, you're increasing its value with investment capital, and then you're making the whole pot work harder. And what's really cool about income share agreements is the academic institutions are liable for 20% of the first loss, right? So you're trying to control the higher education industry to not missell courses that won't lead to higher income. And so everyone's got skin in the game. And this has been operated for 5 years now. We've seen a 90% repayment track record. Obviously, it's an income share, so it's kind of like interest because you pay additional payment. And overall, that Philanthropic Capital is recycling at 9% return. And these are the kinds of ideas that really capture me, and I think they capture clients because they're actually achievable. It's just a question of building up track record. You have to do it carefully. You don't want to scale too fast. But inside 10 to 15 years, I honestly think we can have created, as we did with clean energy, a new entire investable asset class that no longer needs any subsidy because we all understand the risk.
Is what you described kind of the framework for what you call catalytic capital then and collective
Absolutely.
philanthropy? Like, is that what the difference is?
I mean, ultimately, catalytic, I suppose, is a definition that you're going to get not 1-to-1 return, but ideally 1-to-2 or 1-to-10, or there are varying different ways of being catalytic. Partnered up with the London School of Economics and a major philanthropist called Sir Paul Marshall, who set up the Marshall Institute, to create an impact accelerator, literally to find the impact unicorns of the next decade. These are probably they're post seed, so they're already organizations that have proven their business model, but then you want to take that business model and 100x it. So that's one pathway for catalytic philanthropy. Another way in which people can participate, because it is to take a collective approach, right? So instead of you doing it on your own, you say, look, actually, I'm not sure it's almost like venture capital, isn't it? I'm not sure which of these 10 ideas or 20 ideas have the potential for 100x. Why don't I take a slice of all 20? And that's where, some pooling of resources, and so one of our collectives is called the Accelerate Collective. We have clients who, basically the premise is, I'm not giving my money away, I'm trying to recycle it. We operate almost like a fund manager, so we aggregate that capital, but then the clients come alongside us to learn how all these different instruments work. But by pooling those resources, you actually then increase the amount that can be invested, you diversify it, and you're more likely to recycle it. So that's one model of collectives that I think are really powerful. The other model of collectives that is really powerful is when you're trying to solve an issue and you don't have any idea of how to do it. So we had a number of clients who are super worried actually about climate change. And again, this is a classic example. Where should we intervene? Is it energy? Is it here? So we did a deep analysis and we said, actually, we think philanthropic capital is most needed in nature-based solutions where people and planet intersect. So how do you do that, right? Well, we weren't sure. No one was really knew, but we felt like that was the area to work on. And again, we pulled together 10 families, putting $1 million in each. Not a huge sum of money, but actually quite a lot in that particular area because no one was doing it. And by having that pooled capital, suddenly some really cool things happened. All the organizations working in Southeast Asia started saying, or we said to them, look, stop telling us how brilliant you are and that you could solve the issue on your own because you can't. Let's bring you together so you can build a collective impact approach and actually work together on a theory of change that we think can be applied and scaled. So you start to get this kind of concentric circles of this collective action having more impact. And then where we're at now, 2 years in, I think we've funded 45 different startup pilot projects, all with a view to trying to arrive at an investable business model that can then scale the preservation of these precious coastal and marine ecosystems. And if we find those business models and we prove out the risk, we can then raise actual investment capital to scale it up.
I mean, the model you're talking about, it's so different than what most people view as philanthropy. And I would imagine that, 15 years ago when you guys were starting, you only had $10 million or $20 million. Like you would be looking at or even happy with small organizations that were doing good. What's it like now? Like, can you only work with scaled up organizations that have 150 staff, multi-countries, or are you still able to work with the really small organizations, but you just have to then create a platform where they can come together?
Actually, funnily enough, I'm not sure it does, in the sense that we still do seed grants on innovations, even within that collective I just described. I mean, 10 million going across 45 different partners. I mean, some are getting a bigger chunk and they're subcontracting, like it's very small scale pilots trying different techniques, right? In my experience is the impact strategies, the impact unicorn concepts, tend to come more from the startup end. People focused on efficiency, driving cost of outcome down, and then scaling that up than it does taking the existing paradigm and trying to make it more efficient. I think what we've tried to do now is just find, put more structures in place and work through more different kinds of partnerships. Like we use the term impact economy, which is kind of ultimately trying to get to a place where the whole economy values the social and economic contribution of people and safeguarding the planet in all investment decisions. Well, economies function by having, you have to have people who can do bond rating, you have people who can advise on your business case. So you need a whole ecosystem around social enterprises or social businesses that drive impact to help them scale up, and incubate. And some of those things are starting to exist, but they don't exist perfectly. So as I mentioned earlier, things like accelerators. So we don't need to do that bit. Well, if we can create a platform where leading academic experts can plug in with business people who are willing to give their time for free, because that's part of philanthropy, or even not, take an equity stake in the thing they're advising because they're passionate about it, whatever works, right? But just bring that kind of ecosystem strength to some of these ideas. That's how you accelerate. That's how we do it in the venture world. This is how we think we should do it in the impact world. But that doesn't mean you only do the massive ticket sizes.
But if on one end they're kind of giving money away to, say, a charity, let's say $500,000 to plant mangroves. But on the other one, they're investing into a company that is taking those mangroves, wrapping them up in some biodiversity credits, and they end up IPOing and they get 5%. Is there a risk that we shift only to like for-profit, I can enjoy the upside kind of models?
For me, the holy grail, the vision is the 10 trillion that gets settled into philanthropic vehicles over the next 15 years is all in on impact and still makes enough income to still do all the granting that it would have done, right? So you're literally having impact with your investing, you're having impact with the giving. For me, that's just like win-win. And currently that's not quite happening, but we're starting to see that it could happen, particularly with the role of blended finance. We did another one in Kenya where we were investing in the only domestic supply of oxygen in Kenya just before COVID. We managed to increase the amount of domestic oxygen production in Kenya by fivefold, so like 200,000 to 1 million more babies being able to have oxygen. And that only happened because we had a blended pool of capital that allowed us to lend at 9%, because the open market cost of capital for that business was 26. What are some of the biggest restraining factors? I think some of the biggest restraining factors are people still want to stay in their lane. They want to do their own project. They want to maybe put their name on it, those kinds of things. Now, like, I'm not criticizing that. It's your money. People can do what they want. What I am seeing increasingly, though, is if they genuinely want to solve issues, if you have to be smart, you have to kind of be strategic, you have to partner with others, you have to pool resources. And again, it's a both and thing. Sometimes people, they want to do their local school, they want to do all these things. That's fine. Start to allocate some of your resources to this more strategic way of driving catalytic capital, of really driving impact at scale, and you won't regret it.
How have you seen the other side of the equation with the organizations? How are they adapting to this? How are they leveling up their own game? Because you can throw a bunch of money into them, but if they're still as inefficient as they were 15 years ago and they're still in their old models, you're not going to get that return. So how are they adapting? What are you seeing over there in terms of like best practices right now?
So I think that the best organizations that we work with are beginning with scale in mind. So one of my favorites is an organization called Rising Academies. We did their first $250,000 grant, right? And their theory of change was, which they're basically asking to test, was we think we can boost learning outcomes for kids in West Africa using a fairly simple curriculum on an iPad. An 18-year-old could deliver. It doesn't necessarily need to be a qualified teacher. We invested in them to test that. They basically proved that they could improve efficiency and learning gain. And they've built their entire model based on that price per outcome. And then they started to apply that to different business models. So they were thinking about scale in mind. And they actually have 3 different business models. They've got low-cost private schools, which is, say, $268 per child per year. Parents pay. They've got public-private partnerships where governments are paying $120 per child per year. So they're changing the dosage. And then they're in an outcomes contract, a pay-for-success instrument that we're invested in, which is only $68 per child per year. But each time, all they're doing is taking the same core concept and working out how they can get the outcome at an ever-decreasing price, ultimately. And then that makes it more applicable and more scalable. So when we vet organizations, that's one of the first things we say is, okay, great, you've got an intervention that you think can drive impact. How are you going to measure that? Okay, now, is the price of that actually scalable? Because one of the things that I see a lot, particularly in traditional philanthropy, is philanthropists do good stuff, but it's doing it at, I don't know, $500 per child. it's just not scalable. So it's great for the 1,000 kids who benefit, but then that ties up perpetual resource to keep it open, which maybe could have been used differently if you'd thought with scale in mind at the beginning. So that's what I really encourage the social enterprise sector to think about is, what is my cost per outcome? How can I bring that down as I go to scale? What are the different pathways for me to scale? And actually that, as I said at the beginning of this point, may even dictate your ultimate corporate structure. And we've done a lot now of grants that convert to equity, because we found that equity is actually easier to raise in a way, because you have the promise of a potential exit, and it's much more patient.
But if that's where you see things headed and you kind of see a preference for that, what does that mean for the nonprofit sector? Does that mean that they need to start, like, say, Rare, where they have their own kind of fund and they're creating their own for-profit vehicles that are more innovative? Or does it just mean that you're going to find ways of balancing it and you'll have 80% that's for-profit, 20% that's nonprofit? Like, how do you see that impacting the industry?
I think in a way we should move away from for-profit, non-profit, and just talk about for impact and the degree to which that impact is transparently measured. Now, sometimes there is a strong case for it being a non-profit entity, because then it can take tax-enhanced capital. And look, don't get me wrong, there's always going to be a world where we need grants and we need non-profit organizations to do research, to do some ideating and testing. And there's some fields which are much more, for example, justice issues, anti-trafficking, and some of those spaces which are more policy driven, that just require non-profit capacity, right? So where we're talking about almost more of a service driven type of impact, where you're talking about educating people and you've got a constant throughput, or healthcare, you've got a constant throughput. You've got to find a sustainable business model there, right? And that is ultimately got to be plugged into the real world economy. And one of the things that we think is critical for the scale success of these emerging social enterprises is payment for impact. Literally, impact has value. We all know that. The more that we can actually create monetary payment for that impact, the more than viable businesses you have that are literally paid to deliver that impact.
What are 2 or 3 ways you think the ecosystem needs to come together, iterate, adapt to have a greater impact as part of this transition to something that's more collective, more impactful?
I'm a big believer in do tanking, not think tanking. So do stuff, try it, report back, be transparent. And obviously fail fast is obviously is a kind of is something that we see in the non-profit. I mean, in the for-profit world quite a lot. In non-profit, we tend to fail very slowly and silently, and eke stuff out forever.
Because we hate the fact that nonprofits would fail. Yeah.
Because we punish them for it. So, and this is where again, like, collective works well. Because if the philanthropic investors, whether it's at really seed stage or at the middle stage where it's recyclable, getting more comfortable taking risk, and that risk is diversified, then you have the more opportunity to test stuff and fail faster.